refrigerant mixtures. Now first I want to re-hit or readdress a factory mixed refrigerant. The most common factory mixed refrigerant right now is our 407C, which uses a polyester oil, POE oil. But this 407C is a trinary, having 3 refrigerants that make it up. It's actually 52% R134A. It's made of 25% R125 and 23% R32 refrigerants. Those are the 3 refrigerants that make it up. Now the very lowest boiling point is going to be our bubble point. So for example, at 80 psi gauge, my refrigerant 32 is going to have a saturated temperature of about 40 degrees in this mixture. So at 40 degrees, it's going to boil from a liquid to vapor. After all of that refrigerant boils to a vapor, we can now superheat that vapor. And if we add heat, we're going to end up heating to 45. 45 is going to be our R125 refrigerant. It's going to be our medium or mean temperature, average temperature refrigerant. Now at 80 psig, that refrigerant is going to be boiling its own saturation temperature at 45 degrees. So at that point, this refrigerant is now going to change state from a liquid to a vapor. And as we continue to add heat to it, now we're going to get to the saturation temperature of the third refrigerant for R134A. So R134A in this mixture at 80 psig, it's going to boil at 51 degrees Fahrenheit. So after we hit 51 degrees Fahrenheit, this refrigerant is going to boil. Now after we get a temperature higher than 51, at 80 psig and we get above 51 degrees, now we start superheating. That high number is what we call dew point. Dew point is for superheat. Super dew to the rescue. Superman, superheat, flies in the vapor in the sky. So anything above the dew point temperature is going to be a superheated vapor. Anything below the bubble point temperature, 5 degrees down bubble, we all live in a red submarine, red for subcooling, high temperature, high pressure, subcooled liquid. Anything below the bubble point temperature is going to be a subcooled liquid. Now if we're using TD, temperature difference, or average, or anytime we're talking about the evaporator coil or the condensing coil, we want a mean or an average, so the average between those 2 points. So right here, only this refrigerant is going to boil from a liquid to vapor. So then we have to wait till we get to this point. At this point, this refrigerant is starting to boil, but this refrigerant's already superheated. And then after this one boils away above 45, both of these are superheated, but this one's still liquid. After all 3 of these, after we get to this highest point, now all 3 have boiled into a vapor. Going the other way, if we change state, dropping the temperature down, this one has to go from a vapor to liquid, then this one from a vapor to liquid, and then this one from a vapor to a liquid. So that's why we use the bubble point, the lowest point for subcooling, and we use dew, the highest point for superheat. Super dew to the rescue. But this is a factory mixture, and because the factory has mixed these refrigerants together, they know exactly what these numbers are. They put it into a temperature and pressure app. Super dew to the rescue for superheat, and 5 degree down bubble, red October for subcooling. We all live in a red submarine. So those are the basics. Now, first let's just break down this refrigerant. Let's say we're working with these refrigerants individually. If I had only R134A at 80 psi gauge, it would have a boiling temperature of 76 degrees. So if I had only 134A by itself at 80 psi gauge, it would be boiling, changing state at 76 degrees Fahrenheit. Notice that's a much higher number than what we have its boiling point in this mixture. The mixture and the percentage of refrigerants is key to making all these refrigerants boil together. So as I put only this refrigerant in, I'd have a completely different saturated temperature. But because we put it in different mixtures, it changes the saturation temperature. Let's look at R125. By itself at 80 psi gauge would have a saturated temperature of 31 degrees Fahrenheit. Over here, it's boiling at 45, but if we had it by itself, it'd be at 31. But because it's in this mixture, we have an idea where that's boiling at. And let's look also at R32. Here in this mixture, in this percentage, it's boiling at 40 degrees Fahrenheit. But if I had R32 by itself at 80 psi gauge, it would be boiling 20 degrees Fahrenheit. 20 degrees Fahrenheit. That's a huge difference in this. So you can see once we put these different refrigerants in a mixture, it changes the boiling point of all 3 refrigerants. Now they all have to be working together. The cool thing is the factory has done all of these testings and they've put this temperature and pressure chart together for us to be able to have these numbers easily available. But what would happen if we change the mixture? What happens if we ended up with different percentages right here? That'd be what we call fractionation. We end up losing more refrigerant than another. Now, if I had a refrigerant leak in the liquid line, all the liquids coming out at the same exact rate, we wouldn't have an issue. If I had a leak in the suction side, we wouldn't have an issue. But if I had a leak in the middle of the evaporator, maybe it was leaking here, here, or here, we could lose more of one refrigerant than another. Same thing on the condenser side. If I had a leak in that condenser, I could lose more of one of these refrigerants than another. And that would be called fractionation. Once we have fractionation, it changes the percentages of the mixture of refrigerants. Now that we have different percentages, all of these numbers are out off the table. So when we end up with fractionated refrigerants, we're going to have to recover all of the refrigerant out and then put in all new refrigerant. Now, for most refrigerants, it's not an issue. R410A, it's a near azeotrope refrigerant. It acts almost like a single compound. We won't have any issue with topping it off for the life of that system. But if I had a 407C or some of these other high glide refrigerants, it is possible, depending on where that leak is at, to have fractionation. So if you have a leak in the evaporator coil with a 407C, you may have to be looking at replacing the refrigerant. Or if you had a leak in the condensing coil itself, I personally would still want to pull all that refrigerant out and go with new refrigerant, just to make sure that the last person didn't end up with a fractionation issue. Now we understand the importance of fractionation and the mixtures of the refrigerant. What happened if we were to mix refrigerants in the field? Now, the EPA says do not do this. You cannot recycle these different mixtures. Here, they know what refrigerant's in here, and they can still recycle 407C. But what would happen if we illegally mixed R22 and some other replacement? Remember, they're using the words drop-in, but drop-in does not exist. There's no such thing as a true drop-in by definition of the EPA. So if we take a look at the zerotrope, it's 427A, and this is a very popular replacement, retrofit replacement for R22. So if we took all the R22 out of the system and replaced it with this refrigerant, it's a high glide refrigerant, let's take a look at what would be happening. R427A is 25% R125A. It's 50% R134A. It is 10% R143A, and it's 15% R32. At least two of those we know are flammable refrigerants. Now, if we take a look at what's happening with these refrigerants, there's four. I don't know what four would be. Quaternary, I don't know. I don't know what four would be, but there's four refrigerants in here. With this refrigerant, under these percentages, if these percentages change, everything changes. But under this percentages, if I have R32 in there, that's going to be the refrigerant that's going to be boiling first. At 77 psi gauge, that refrigerant in this mixture will be boiling at 40 degrees Fahrenheit. As we add heat to that, that refrigerant is going to boil completely away and superheat. If I keep heating it, the next refrigerant is going to be 143A. In this mixture, I don't know what temperature 143A is going to boil. Let's just throw out a number and say it's 43. This is a complete guess. I do not know. This one I can know, that one I do not know. I don't know how to find out. But 143A would be boiling, changing state at about 43. Now, as that completely changes state from liquid to vapor, then we're in this sensible heat again. We're going to change the temperature of both of these gases until we hit refrigerant 134A. Now, this 134A is going to start changing state at approximately, I'm not really sure, let's just say 48. So at 48 degrees Fahrenheit at 77 psig, it's now at saturation, changing state from a liquid to a vapor. After it completely changes state from liquid to vapor, all three of these are now superheating, and we're going to heat up until we get to 50 degrees Fahrenheit. At 50 degrees Fahrenheit, we're going to have refrigerant 125. R125 is going to start changing state from a liquid to a vapor, that latent heat. Now, once this refrigerant changes state from a liquid to a vapor, and I continuously add heat above 50 degrees, now we're going to be superheating all the refrigerant. That's why it's super dew to the rescue. The dew point temperature, the actual suction temperature minus the super dew temperature, that's going to be our superheated vapor. Anything below 40 degrees Fahrenheit is going to be my subcooled liquid at 77 psig. Remember, the pressure is going to change all these as well, but at these percentages, that's approximately what we're looking at. On a refrigeration cycle, the refrigerant's going to come in as a saturated, meaning this R32 is going to be changing state. It's going to be boiling first. It's going to be changing state from a liquid to vapor. Then we're going to have some sensible heat gain, and then we're going to start boiling the 143A. 143A is going to change state from liquid to vapor. Now both of these refrigerants are going to start superheating. Then we're going to have the 134A. We're eventually going to get to 134A. It's going to start changing state from liquid to vapor. Once it turns to vapor, we can then be superheating all three of these until we hit 50 degrees Fahrenheit. At 50 degrees Fahrenheit, the last refrigerant will be changing state from a liquid to a vapor. As it changes state from liquid to vapor, we can then superheat it beyond that. So our formula will be the actual suction line temperature minus the Suction saturated, dew point temperature equals our superheated vapor. As long as we still have an idea for saturation, we can still figure what's going on. If we're doing TD, the temperature difference between the refrigerant and the air, I'd go with the mean temperature, the average temperature of 45. If it was going with a subcooled liquid on the condensing side, the liquid side, I'd be using the bubble point. Anything below the bubble point, 5 degrees down bubble, subcooling, red submarine, high temperature, high pressure, subcooled liquid. And on the outside, we'd have the mean, the average between the two. In this case, at 77 psig, the mean or average temperature would be 45. That'd be the number we'd use for setting our low ambient controls. If I have these percentages with this refrigerant only, I know what's happening. If you read the instructions, there's a ton of scenarios where you still have to change out all of the POE oil. If your compressor is higher than the evaporator, it has specific instructions that says under these conditions, you have to change out the oil as well. So follow the manufacturer's instructions. But if I know that with this percentage mixtures, I know what my saturations are going to be. But what happens when we start mixing it and making up our own refrigerants? So if I had R22 at 77 psi gauge, I'd have a saturated temperature of about 46 degrees Fahrenheit. So if I had a system that had R22 in it, we could simply add R22. But the problem is that there's people out there right now that's illegally mixing refrigerants. And here's the issue. Once we start mixing this refrigerant, which is already a mixture of 4 other refrigerants, we're now mixing that with R22. We have now 5 refrigerants in there. That'd be what, a Cinco blend? I don't even know how that works. At that point, I'm lost and nobody knows what's going on. We don't even know the percentage of R22 in the system already that's going to be changing all of these percentages. So all of this is out the window. All of this is out the window. Our dew point, our medium, our bubble point, all that is completely gone. We have no clue where saturation is taking place. Absolutely no clue whatsoever. And if we don't know where saturation is taking place, we don't know where a medium is going to be, we don't know where a superheat is going to be, we don't know if we're getting liquid back to the compressor, we absolutely don't know. We're shooting in the dark. Oh yeah, it's blowing cold air and making noise, but we don't know what's happening with that system at all. There's a lot of people that say, well, yeah, but your R22 pressure is 46, is really close to the medium of this refrigerant, so it's going to be the same. It's not going to be the same, and let me show you why. If I had only R125 by itself, R125 has a saturated temperature of 79 degrees Fahrenheit. So by itself, it's 79 degrees Fahrenheit. But if I put it in this mixture, it now changes to a 50 degree Fahrenheit saturated temperature. And now if you add it with 22, you have no clue. R134A by itself, if I did not have the mixture, in other words, solo, how low can you go? Solo, that's how you go. If I had R134A by itself, no mixtures, it would be at 74 degrees Fahrenheit. But we put it in this mixture, and now we're already over here, I'm just guessing 48 degrees. So it's definitely significantly lower. And if I have R143A by itself, R143A is going to be at 33 degrees Fahrenheit by itself, its own refrigerant. But if we put it in this mixture, we drop down to, we're guessing like 43-ish. We don't really know. But it completely changes the saturated mixture when I change the percentages of other refrigerants happening around it. It changed its boiling point. And on top of that, we have R32. R32 by itself, if I only had R32, it would have its saturated temperature so low of 18 degrees Fahrenheit. If we put it in this mixture, it's higher, like 40 degrees Fahrenheit. So because we have these percentage mixtures in here, it changes. All of these numbers are now gone, and we have a new set of numbers. And if we keep the mixture the same, we know what's happening. But if I was to change these mixtures, in other words, even have fractionation, all of this would be out the window. Now, if we change this with even another refrigerant, a 5th refrigerant, R22 is already there. If you're going to mix refrigerants, at least put a tag in there so the next man or woman coming along can actually know what is happening inside that system, and they're not going to be looking at their superheat and subcooling and thinking, man, everything is off. This doesn't make sense at all. And at least the next person can have the choice of recovering all that refrigerant so they can protect that compressor. But if you understand the refrigeration cycle, if you understand saturation and these mixtures, mixing refrigerants is a complete killer. It just ruins everything we work for in this whole entire system. Even having only one refrigerant and having it fractionate can be an issue. So hopefully this gives you an understanding of factory mix systems where we can have graphs and charts, we know what's happening, versus people trying to mix in the field and there's everything out the window. The manufacturers and these people work in labs, they do tons of studies. How much oil returns coming through, how much heat's being absorbed, how much superheat's happening. All of these things, they do a massive amount of research and they give us that little cool little chart. There is millions of dollars in research on that chart for us to follow. Now we're trying to do that in the field and just guess. It's blowing cold and making noise. You don't have a clue what's happening. No clue what's happening in that system whatsoever. So hopefully this gives you a little idea of why it's so important to not mix refrigerants, and why, even though it's the same pressure, that pressure of two different refrigerants throws everything completely out the window. Let's take a look at one more example, R410A. So 410A is an easy one. It's a binary that's only got two refrigerants. At 118 psig, our dew point's about 40 degrees Fahrenheit, and our bubble point's 40 degrees Fahrenheit, and our mean or average is 40 degrees Fahrenheit. There's some decimals in there. You can see it's a near azeotrope. It is near a single mixture, especially at this temperature. As the temperature gets higher, that splits, but there's only two refrigerants. It is 50% HFC 32 and it's 50% 125. So at 118 psi gauge, they're both boiling or changing state at 40 degrees Fahrenheit. But once we put them in solo, if we put R32 solo, notice how close it is. It's at 39. But the 125 jumps over here to 51. If we had only refrigerant 125 in there, it would be a 51 degree saturated temperature. So once we start mixing refrigerants, and this is an easy 50-50 mixture, one refrigerant's close, the other one jumps really far off. So if we were trying to mix refrigerants, these numbers change incredibly fast. We have no clue what's happening. Make sure we have the proper refrigerant, the AHRI identified approved refrigerant with a temperature pressure chart that goes with it. Now we know superheat subcooling, or at least we know superheat with dew point, super dew to the rescue, and subcooling with bubble point, 5 degree down bubble. We all live in a red submarine, red for subcooling, high pressure subcooled liquid. And please, please, I beg you, do not mix refrigerants, and if you do, label it mixed on that unit so somebody else knows what's happening.